Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Australian reimbursement. Thank you all today for joining us in this webinar. My name is Tammy and I'm from Bramble Biomedical. To give you a brief introduction, we are a regulatory consultancy firm based in Sydney with offices in New Zealand and Beijing. We provide global regulatory strategy and assist with pre-market submissions as well as post-market compliance, and we've been providing these services for about coming up to 15 years. Our webinar today is about understanding how Australian reimbursement works and what the likely costs and benefits are of entering the Australian market. Before we begin, I'd just like to go through some housekeeping rules. So in front of you, you should see a screen which has some question and similar to this here. It's got a question box and it gives you an opportunity to type in any questions that you'd like to ask during the webinar. We will collect these questions and they will be answered at the end of the webinar. And if we do run out of time, please note that we will follow up with you directly via email. Also, before we start, I would just recommend that you close off any applications or browsing windows which might compete with the internet bandwidth. So to present this webinar, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Sarah Griffin. Sarah is the principal of our partner organisation at Medtechnique Consulting. She's a health economist and reimbursement strategist who represents multiple medical device organisations ranging from startups to multinationals to gain reimbursement access in Australia. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sarah to proceed with the webinar.
Good morning everyone, thank you very much for joining us. What we'd like to do today is just discuss, give you a bit of an outline on how the Australian health system works so you have a bit of context, and look at how you can manage to get your devices into Australia in a profitable manner. So first of all, here's a map of Australia and New Zealand. The reason I show this is just to show you that Australia is a network of states with a federal government and lots of little local governments that run the local states. And here are our friends here over in New Zealand. And if we do have a little time, I'll have a bit of a discussion about New Zealand, but primarily we're talking about Australia today. Now, just for those of you in the US, Australia is roughly the size of the US, but we only have a population of 23 million. So we're quite highly regulated with all these different states as well as the federal government. So, talking about Australia, we have a universal health coverage system known as Medicare. But unlike the US Medicare, it actually covers every single citizen in Australia and without restriction. So if you're an Australian citizen, you are covered by Medicare. So Medicare comprises a free public hospital system. So all care in public hospitals is free and there's no restriction. It is only restricted by the usual budget constraints and waiting lists commonly found in public hospital systems. We also have a system of subsidised pharmaceuticals, which is very comprehensive and also covers every citizen. And we also have a mixture of free and subsidised hospital visits outside of hospital admissions. Okay, I just want to have a look at the different hospital systems. So, almost half of all Australians have private health insurance. Private health insurance primarily covers admissions into hospitals. And the reason Australians opt to have private health insurance when we have a public hospital system is that it allows them to minimise waiting lists, choose their own doctor and have a private room, all of which is not guaranteed in the public system. So more than half of all elective procedures are performed in private hospitals. What we find in Australia is that private hospitals tend to like to perform procedures that are repetitive. For example, hip and joint replacements, maternity services, cardiac programs. Private hospitals aren't as interested in trauma, there's very few private emergency rooms, or very, very complex procedures such as transplant services. Services such as these tend to happen in public hospitals. But for device suppliers, the private hospitals are very important and a lucrative market for medical device suppliers. While it's highly regulated, if you can get reimbursement in a private hospital, it almost guarantees you that you will have excellent market access and your device will be used. Okay, there's many pathways to device reimbursement in Australia. It's quite complex. So unlike getting your device regulatory approval, which means you're allowed to sell it in Australia, what reimbursement allows you to have someone to pay for it, and it's much more complicated than simply regulatory inclusion, because there's absolutely not one single pathway and you don't deal with a single agency. It can get quite complicated. And in addition, all the health technology assessment agencies in Australia are constantly upping the ante in terms of clinical and economic evidence. And that's certainly not going to get any better. It's just going to get tougher and tougher as we move along, and there's more pressure on both public and private budgets. In some cases, depending on the medical device, you're going to have to use multiple strategies at the same time to make sure you have maximum market access and the best price for your device. Okay, we'll talk about the three main agencies. So for those who aren't familiar with the term, HTA is Health Technology Assessment. So primarily we'll be talking about the first two on your screen, which is the Medical Services Advisory Committee and the Prostheses List Advisory Committee. The Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee determines which drugs receive public subsidy in Australia. And this is interesting and relevant because it was practically the first organisation in the world that took into account not only the clinical effectiveness but also the cost effectiveness of drugs to determine public subsidy. And the other two agencies that deal with devices, MSAC here and the PLARC, the Prostheses List Advisory Committee, are concerned with procedures and devices, but they draw on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Committee as their source of a lot of regulation and a lot of their evidence and economic guidelines. So first of all, we'll talk about how to access the private system, because as I stated before, this is a very lucrative area for medical device suppliers in Australia. So to give you just a little background, the Australian Medicare system pays doctors to perform procedures in private hospitals. So not only do they pay for care in the public hospitals, but they will also pay a benefit to doctors in private hospitals to perform procedures. But there's a bit of a catch because Australian private health insurers are only obliged to pay if the procedure is included on the medical benefits schedule, commonly known as the MBS. I might just click to this slide first. So the medical benefits schedule is a list of procedures for which Medicare will pay a benefit to doctors or other health professionals. It includes both in and outpatient procedures. And this schedule is extremely important because it forms the basis of the entire Australian reimbursement system. So basically the MBS, and if anyone ever wants to have a look at it, you just go to www.mbs.gov.au and you'll see the list of procedures. And the MBS, it has an uncapped budget, but it is always a very political tool of government, and there's a concerted effort by government to contain costs on a continual basis. So getting a new procedure on the MBS is quite a complex but very essential process. So MSAC is the Medical Services Advisory Committee, which manages and determines which new procedures go on the MBS. So if you happen to have a device that doesn't have an associated procedure on the MBS, you will have to apply to MSAC to have that device included on the MBS. So the Medical Services Advisory Committee is a statutory body. It's independent, and they're charged with advising the Australian Minister of Health on the safety, effectiveness and cost effectiveness of new procedures. So that's, if you break that down, that's quite a lot of things they have to assess. So firstly, they have to determine the safety of the procedure, just whether we're going to hurt anyone by a new procedure, the effectiveness, so the clinical effectiveness, whether the procedure works or not, and the cost effectiveness. So that's, three big things that you have to prove if you want to get a new procedure that involves your medical device on the medical benefits schedule. So MSAC recommends to the Minister of Health whether new procedures should be included on the medical benefits schedule. I'll just skip that slide. So doing that, we have to make an application to the MSAC committee. An MSAC application is extremely complex and time consuming. It can take, generally I'd allow 2 years for an MSAC application from the beginning to the end, and sometimes depending on the complexity or the cost of the procedure, it can take longer. Often these applications are not successful. The Australian government puts a high bar on what procedures they believe that taxpayers' money should be spent on. And there's several stages. I won't go through all the stages in this application, in this presentation, but essentially there's an initial short application, there's a protocol development stage, there's a submission stage, and then there's an assessment stage. Each of these is highly regulated and can take several months at a time. The whole process is quite bureaucratic, and also the final decision to fund a procedure can be very political. So what we need to understand is that even though the MSAC committee might make a recommendation for a procedure to be included on the MBS, it still may not be, because the final decision by the government is actually whether the procedure is affordable. And also, like in any government, there's lots and lots of lobbyists and voices and influences that will lean on a government to determine which way they're going to go with the new procedure. So what MSAC makes a recommendation on, as I was talking about before, is the safety, effectiveness and cost effectiveness. That is, if there's a positive recommendation that a new procedure is to be listed on the medical benefits schedule, that then goes to the Department of Finance, which will determine whether the procedure is affordable. Now this is the black hole of an MSAC application, because unlike MSAC, which meets at specified times during the year, the Department of Finance acts under no such schedule, and they are not held to any time frames. So quite often, even if you have a positive recommendation, your application can sit in finance for months before you know whether it's going to go on the MBS. Sometimes it can happen remarkably quickly, and other times it will sit and sit and sit. Not surprisingly, the more expensive procedures that will tend to have a bigger impact on the federal budget take much longer to get through the Department of Finance. But only once finance has determined that it is affordable for the Australian government will that procedure be included on the NBS. Okay, the evidence and economic requirements of an MSAC application are quite daunting. The evidence requirements have been adapted from the pharmaceutical world. If you remember, I spoke about the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, and that being the first organisation in the world that took cost effectiveness into advice in determining drug subsidies. The evidence requirements are based on those drugs, and anyone who works in devices knows that it's very, very difficult to run clinical trials that produce the same level of evidence that drugs do. So there's a preference for meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials, and this is often an impossible requirement in the real world of devices, as we know. So we have to work with what we've got, but the constant assessment will be based against that gold standard of meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials. You have to provide a full economic model that's completed to an extremely high standard, so there's no shortcuts. So generally models will be cost effectiveness, cost utility, or in certain cases cost minimisation, but they need to be done they actually need to be done with the most excruciating level of detail, but and they're subject to a very severe critique. There also has to be a full budget analysis, because if you've got, not only is the cost effectiveness taken into account, that is whether the new procedure is good value for money, but what impact that will actually have on the federal budget. And all of this will be subject to an extremely rigorous critique by the MSAC committee, which is made up of eminent physicians, epidemiologists and health economists. So it's quite a daunting process to enter into. So an MSAC application can't just be done by anyone. It requires a team of people, and there's a number of organisations which can do this. So it requires a number of professionals, including a medical librarian, a statistician, an economic modeller, and also it's very important to have someone who can represent your company to the Department of Health if you're undertaking one of these applications, because you need someone to pull it all together and who understands how the Department of Health works in Australia. So if you're not completely scared off by that process, you should take into account that these should not be entered into, an MSAC application should not be entered into unless you're extremely confident of your clinical and economic evidence. And as to costs, depending on whether you do these in-house, which most companies don't, or whether you hire consultants, you're probably looking at somewhere between $100,000 to $200,000 in fees to get it through from beginning to end. Sometimes it can be more if it's extremely complex. Say, for example, you're working with a so before you embark on any tweak, get who being measured and scheduled. Only apply pay medical procedure that encompasses your device already in the schedule. But the MBS is how doctors get paid, so naturally it's very important to them. But it also underpins the Australian DRG system to some extent. So if your device involves a new procedure, then a new MBS number will be required. If it doesn't, you can use an existing MBS number to have your device included in the private hospital system. Okay, well moving on, this is more about the private hospital system. In Australia we have something that's quite strange and unique. It's called the Prostheses List, and it's not generally replicated in other health systems. What the Prostheses List, and this applies only to the private hospital system, is a list of medical devices used in surgical procedures for which health funds must pay a benefit in a private hospital. So what this means is that even though a health insurer may pay a case-based payment or a case mix payment or a DRG payment to a hospital for admitting a patient to have a procedure, if that procedure involves a device that is included on the prosthesis list, then the health insurer must pay a prescribed benefit over and above any case payment, which, as you can understand, is very, very useful if you're a device supplier. This list is issued twice a year in February and August, and currently it has about 9,000 to 10,000 products included on it. Again, Australians seem to love regulation, so it's quite an exhaustive and complex process to get an application on, to get a device included on the prosthesis list. The whole system is inherently biased towards health insurers. It is devised to keep prices as low as possible and to put a cap on the amount of money that is spent on medical devices. So, for example, the current arrangements as they sit now have been in place for about, I think, since 2007. And there have been no increases in the prices since then. So effectively, when we take into account inflation, medical inflation, then actually the devices are decreasing in price each year. That being said, the prices on the prosthesis list are still considered very good in international terms, and most device suppliers are not complaining about the prices they receive under this system. However, there is a continual downward pressure on benefits. Okay, so what do we need to do to get our device on the prosthesis list? Again, it's not that easy. The first priority is, of course, to have your device registered for sale in Australia. So it must have an ARTG number, which is the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. So that's the first step. Secondly, the procedure must happen in a hospital. So say, for example, you have a device that is commonly used in a general practitioner setting or in a doctor's office. That would not be included on the prosthesis list. You have to be an admitted patient into a private hospital. Excuse me. Again, it must have a medical benefits schedule item number associated with the procedure. If you don't have that number, then you need to go through the whole MSAC process that we discussed before. And also, and I'm quoting directly from the Prostheses List regulations here, the product should be surgically implanted in the patient. So the somewhat old-fashioned name of prostheses means that your device must be surgically implanted in the patient, and the patient must walk out of the hospital with that device inside them. So originally, when this legislation had its beginnings about 20 years ago, people were always thinking about hip replacements and knee replacements. Of course, things have moved on since then, and technology is much more complex. So this can be very problematic to device suppliers whose devices don't specifically meet this criteria, and I'll discuss that a little bit further later on. So it must replace an anatomical part. So again, the hip or knee joint replacement is a good example. Or combat a pathological process. So another example might be a pacemaker or an implantable defibrillator. So it's actively combating a disease or some sort of illness. Or modulate a physiological process. So again, the example of a pacemaker or a implantable defibrillator, or perhaps a heart valve. Any of these sort of examples meet these criteria. So there's a few other, I'll just go back a bit. There's a few other criteria that are also useful. So say, for example, your device is essential to implanting a prosthesis. So say, for example, you have a delivery system that is essential to implant a device. You could get that included on the prosthesis list as well. But the ultimate aim of all the devices that are included on the prosthesis list is that they must be implanted and the patient must walk out of the hospital with that device inside them. So this is a little table of actual real examples that I've come across in my work of things that have been quite contentious when we tried to get them on the prosthesis list. So the first one is radioactive beads for the treatment of cancer. So these are, for those unfamiliar, they're just little radioactive beads that are generally implanted in the prostate or other areas, and they emit radiation. These are on the prosthesis list and are paid for. However, if you've got a device that's an implantable tissue marker for radiotherapy, that is not a prosthesis. And the reason being, even though it's implanted, it doesn't in and of itself combat a pathological process or modulate a physiological process. So, you know, we have these really strange differences between quite similar devices. So the example I gave before of pacemakers and implantable defibrillators, very clearly implanted in the patient walks out, they modulate a physiological process, and they are reimbursed by the prosthesis list at actually very, very good prices. However, on the other hand, cardiac ablation catheters, which are quite expensive, are not considered a prosthesis because even though they perform a similar function to pacemakers and defibrillators and they combat heart arrhythmias, cardiac ablation catheters are only used once and they're thrown away. So the patient doesn't walk out of the hospital with those devices inside them. And so my last example, and this I think this is oft quoted in Australia, cardiac stents implanted into coronary arteries to prevent angina and heart attacks are covered by the prosthesis list. So every single stent that's put in a private hospital will receive for the device maker about $3,000. However, a pressure wire, which is a device that determines whether a stent is needed and has excellent clinical evidence that says that it reduces the use of stents and prevents heart attacks and angina, is not reimbursed because it's a single-use item and it is thrown away at the end of the procedure. These distinctions can be extremely problematic. So just go back to that for a second. The reason being they end up creating perverse economic incentives within the private hospital system, as hospitals naturally will want to use devices that are reimbursed by the health funds, because all these devices on the right-hand side they have to pay for out of their reimbursement for the procedure from the health fund. So, for example, if they get a case-based payment for a cardiac cath lab procedure, they will receive additional reimbursement for every single stent that they will have to pay for the pressure wire out of their case payment. So it does create a lot of difficulties both for the hospital and for the device manufacturer. So let's look at the clinical and economic requirements to get on the prostheses list. And these can be quite challenging at times as well. So basically, if there's an already listed device on the prostheses list, so if I go back to our example of the hip or knee replacement, if you're bringing a new hip replacement into Australia, actually I'll use a different example. So if you're bringing a new spinal plate into Australia, you can claim substantial clinical equivalence with an already listed device. Say ours is just the same as theirs or very similar, and it's a fairly straightforward procedure. It's called claiming substantial clinical equivalence. However, some devices can't do that. So for example, 2 years of clinical evidence is needed for devices, and I'm quoting here from the regulations: durability, all high-risk devices, mobile load-bearing devices, or new devices using novel technology or design. So this 2-year evidence requirement is a bit strange, because obviously it's a very arbitrary, it doesn't, they generally don't specify what type of clinical evidence is required, but you must present 2 years follow-up on a new device or using novel technology, you know, all load-bearing hip or knee devices, ankle devices, for example, new heart valve, anything that is considered high risk or very new. Also, once you've let through that hurdle of getting your device approved clinically after you've presented this evidence, if your device is new or you would like a higher price than other similar devices on the prostheses list, you must go through this very strange process called benefit validation. And this is fairly unique to the prostheses list, and I haven't seen this process in other jurisdictions. And the information that is requested includes overseas pricing, what you're selling your device for overseas, the cost of goods of bringing them into the country, what you're selling it for in the public sector, shipping costs. And the reason this information is asked for is that there's a very high suspicion on the part of health insurers in Australia that they're paying too much for the devices, and they're seeking to find out by asking for this information whether they're being ripped off or not. So there's no obligation to provide this information. However, you should, if it suits your purpose, you can supply this. And there's no methodology published as to how this information is assessed. So it's very strange, it's very difficult to deal with, and you have to be very, very careful about what you determine to disclose. So this is where you probably need really good advice when you're submitting a Prostheses List application as to how you handle this section. You can also use more conventional types of health economic analyses such as cost minimisation, cost utility, or cost effectiveness studies that basically are more interested in these types of information. Okay, so how is all this evidence assessed by the Prostheses List Advisory Committee? The evidence is assessed by a panel of specialist physicians. Until very recently, these physicians their names weren't even published, and it still remains a very, very opaque process. There's no methodology published. It's very difficult for sponsors to understand how their evidence is assessed against what criteria, and the results can be considered inconsistent at best. So if your device is rejected for some reason, it's often quite hard to get a straight answer as to why an application was rejected, and you can get into a quite complex correspondence program with the Department of Health to determine why and to try and get that decision overturned. So, this is another area where if you're bringing a device in from another country, it's often very useful to have someone handle this for you in Australia, because it can get quite complicated and quite political. Okay. But after we've jumped through all these hoops, being included on the Prostheses List is extremely valuable for medical device companies. It guarantees a price for your device in private hospitals. Therefore, private hospitals do not have to consider including the cost of your device when they're calculating their procedure costs, because it is paid for over and above any case payment they receive. Also, doctors don't need to consider the price when choosing a device because it's covered. Not that doctors disregard the cost of a device, but since they're not paying for it and the hospital they are working in is not paying for that device, it does make the decision to choose a device somewhat easier. Okay, a few things to remember about a prosthesis application. They're very time constrained, so you need to make sure that you submit your application on time. So my advice to my clients is that as soon as they have submitted for product registration in Australia and they have an implantable device, they should make the submission to the Prostheses List at the same time. Of course, the processes can work in tandem, and you can save yourself 6 to 12 months in time getting to market if you do this. So applications are more difficult, as we discussed, if the device is novel or if a higher price is being sought. So what if your device is not a prosthesis? So this can pose quite a challenge for suppliers in the private sector, and it will depend upon the nature and the cost of the device. Not being a prosthesis doesn't mean that you don't have access to the private sector. It just means that you have to approach the whole thing in a different way. So higher cost devices that are disposable or are used on a number of patients will have to demonstrate their economic and clinical benefits to the hospital. So, however, on occasions, as we discussed before earlier on, there are perverse economic incentives that exist if you're competing with a Prostheses List product. If you remember my example about the pressure wires and the stents. So this can be quite a challenge for some device suppliers if you get caught in this little area. Okay, we'll move on to the public system. The public system is less complex, so medical devices can be sold into the public system as soon as they receive TGA registration. So there is often a delay, a difference in access to devices because of this. However, the public hospital system is financed by activity-based funding or DRG funding, at least for the next 2 years. We have a new government, relatively new government in Australia, which is rapidly dismantling activity-based funding. but at least for the next 2 years is we have it, and it's very likely that most states will continue on some sort of DRG funding into the future. So what this means, in order to be successful in the public sector, devices must be able to demonstrate their clinical and economic benefits. So we generally sell to the public system under competitive tender, and any device that is able to demonstrate good clinical performance or economic use of resources should be able to be successful selling into the public sector. So I just want to look at new technologies and procedures in general in Australia. So there's no really good system for accommodating new technology in Australia. There's some new technology grants in some states, but competition is quite fierce. And our DRG system, or ARDRG, which stands for Australian Refined DRG system, it's quite clunky, and it takes about 6 years to release a new DRG. However, there's really no barrier to new technology in the public sector if you can actually persuade someone to pay for it. So for new procedures, it's a bit of a catch-22 because the ARDG system is retrospective. So we need to have evidence of use in the public sector to create a new DRG. And obviously it's quite hard to get your device used in the public sector if there's no DRG to cover it. So I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately. Okay, another thing that's very useful in Australia is cost models. So cost models are quite useful when there's no formal reimbursement available, say that your device isn't a prosthesis and it just fits into a DRG. So they can be extremely useful for demonstrating value. And they're an excellent marketing tool if they're done well and they're developed on local data. A lot of companies outside Australia try and use models that are developed for the country of origin, say the US or the UK. They have to be developed locally using local data, or they just don't work. But the cost of developing a model can be recouped fairly quickly with minimal additional sales, so it's always something you should think about if you're bringing a device into Australia, to get a little model developed around your new device. Okay, we're getting pretty close to question time. So basically, just my advice to anyone who's bringing a new medical device in Australia is to get really good advice before entering the market, because sometimes it may not be commercially feasible to bring a device into Australia. And I've seen many companies spend an awful lot of time and waste an awful lot of money by not following the correct pathway initially. So I think we'll have a look at some questions now. I'm just trying to see them. Now, I've got a question here that says, it appears that a device could be accepted by MSAC and receive an MBS number, but not then placed on the prostheses list. True, and then it says, is this common, and are these devices ultimately successful in the marketplace? Look, it is true that a device could be accepted by MSAC and not placed on the prosthesis list, assuming that you have a new MBS number. However, since MSAC would have done a very expensive evaluation of the procedure, and that would have included the evaluation of the device as part of that procedure, it's probably not likely, unless the device doesn't meet the prosthesis list criteria. For example, that if it's not implantable. So if it's implantable, it's got a new procedure that has been recommended by MSAC, and then you apply for prostheses listing, then in most cases it should be included because of the extensive evaluation it would have already had. I hope that answers that question. Okay, let's look into the next. Okay, have you got any more questions coming through? So I can see there's more questions, but I'm not seeing them just at the moment. Okay, so there was another question about what happens if you don't have 2 years of clinical evidence and how do you manage that? What I would say to you is that if being on the prostheses list is really important for your device, then you need to set about to try and get some sort of 2 years of evidence. So bringing a device into Australia, you can always generally access the public system, and that's a really good place to try and do a clinical trial or look at any of those using the device in the public system, gathering data. You can look at registry data, or you can try and just develop a local trial. But it is a real challenge if you don't have that 2 years of data. For example, a lot of devices that have been introduced into the US have FDA IDE data, and you can try and use that, which have been used successfully in the past. It's better if the data is published, but you can still try and use IDE trials. Okay. Okay, I've got another question is from, says, how cost effective does a procedure or device have to be considered for reimbursement? Now, generally, I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with quality of adjusted life years, but this is a health economic term that is used for assessing the cost of gaining 1 additional year in perfect health. And most cost effectiveness or cost utility analyses use this method. So while there's no legislated number for that, generally in Australia it's considered reimbursable if it's about $50,000 per quality adjusted life year. So that would be what you're aiming at. Okay, it looks like that's about all the questions coming through at the moment. If you have a question that you haven't thought of, please feel free to contact me through the website, which is just www.medtechnique.com.au, and I'll be happy to answer the questions afterwards. And hopefully that was helpful for you.
Thank you, Sarah. We did actually receive quite a few questions, but I see it's a bit hard to view on your platform. But I think as we are coming towards the close of the webinar, what I suggest is we will follow up with your questions directly through email. So even if you do have any upcoming questions, as Sarah mentioned, please send them through either by emailing directly, or you can even post your questions now and we'll get in touch with you. So thank you, Sarah. Is there any further comments from you?
No, I just like to say thank you to everyone. That's helpful, and again, that's your business.
Yep. I think there's a technical problem with the audio just there. But I think what Sarah was saying is just thank you everyone again for joining us in the webinar, and we do hope you found it valuable. As you exit the webinar, there'll be a brief feedback survey that will pop up, and we'd really appreciate the feedback for the webinar. And as mentioned before, please do not hesitate to contact us for any further questions, and we'll be in touch. I've got several questions here that's come up, so we will be in touch with you directly. And on that note, thank you everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.